Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew Newberg, for joining me today. I am so excited to have you. And just a little bit about Dr. Newberg. He is one of the world's renowned neuroscientists. He is a professor of the Department of Integrative Medicine and Department of Radiology. Dr. Newberg is a research director for the Marcus Institute of Integrative Medicine at the Thomas Jefferson University. He has written many books, one of which is How God Changes the Brain. And I would say this is the book that inspired me and get me at least connected with the work of Dr. Newberg. He's also, this is exciting, he's also a pioneer researcher in the field of neurotheology, an exciting field. So I'm so glad, I'm so happy to have him with us today. And Dr. Newberg, welcome and thank you for joining me today.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm looking forward to chatting about all this interesting stuff.
I'm excited. I've been looking forward to something like this for years. I was saying to my wife this morning, she was saying, this is your moment. You've been wanting to talk with this guy for so long, and you finally had the opportunity. So if you're excited, I am burning with excitement just to talk with you. But I'm curious, Dr. Newberg, what led you to this field? You're a neuroscientist. You could have gone in multiple other directions, but you choose to take some of your research, a great part of your research, along the line of God, the connection of neuroscience and God. Why this direction?
Well, I think a lot of it stems from my early childhood, really. I was always encouraged to ask a lot of questions about kind of the nature of things and the nature of reality. And that's in many ways the driving question that I have had through all of my work, which is how do we know what's real? And of course, part of that question about reality comes down to, do we take a scientific perspective? Do we take a religious and spiritual one? And I guess as I kind of went through my training and learning about all these things, I kept feeling that as wonderful as science is, that there are certain limitations that it has in terms of how it addresses certain, why questions. Why are we here? What is the meaning and purpose of life and the universe? But then you have religion and spiritual traditions on the other side, which are also wonderful and provide a lot of important concepts and meaning and so forth, but don't always help with understanding some of the physical pieces of the world. So to me, as I went through my training, I kept kind of looking at both the scientific side and what that could tell us about our brain and how we think and process reality, but also looking at the spiritual side and saying, well, what is, where does that fit in with this? And things about consciousness and the mind and the nature and the reasons for why reality is the way it is. So to me, it was kind of a natural way of blending them. The idea that, well, if we take these two sort of most powerful forces of humanity, maybe we can find a way of bringing them together to get to that ultimate question about the nature of reality and ultimately who we are as human beings. And that's really, and I've been very fortunate to have some wonderful mentors who have also just had that burning question about the nature of reality and understanding that link between the spiritual and the scientific is very relevant for us in terms of how we ultimately put that information together.
I'm curious, probably this is more of a personal question. How has this impacted your own journey, looking into God and how God changes the brain, how God influences our lives on a personal level? What is your greatest discovery from this, and how has this impacted your life?
Well, it's had an impact in several different kinds of ways. And, on one hand, going back to what I mentioned a moment ago, this has been my own spiritual / scientific journey. It has been in my own mind. I spent a lot of time contemplating these questions. And so there's this sense of kind of connecting with the universe in very deep kinds of ways. And of course, also trying to understand it in very scientific kind of ways. So for me, a lot of what has come, across as part of this whole process has been this kind of combined spiritual and scientific journey. And so on one level, it's just been that ongoing process about how I begin to explore these questions in my own way. Now, based on what I have ultimately found, it has also led me down to some ways of thinking about things, which I guess are, I don't know if it changed the way I thought about them, but certainly reinforced it in a lot of ways. And one of the things to me, which is a fundamentally important take-home message, if you will, is that it has given me a tremendous understanding and compassion for people who have different beliefs. That was, one of the things that kind of bothered me growing up is, well, how could people have, we're all looking at the same world, and yet we come away with completely different ways of thinking about it. And some are one religion, some are another, one political party, obviously in the United States, the different political parties. How can we have these different, totally different perspectives? And so, as I have studied and we've scanned now, and I'm sure we'll get into that discussion, we've done brain scans on people from many different traditions, hundreds of different people from all these different traditions. And, people, these are fundamentally important ideas and concepts that are at the core of people's lives. And so I think, having a sense of understanding and compassion, especially in today's world, that to me is one of the big things that I've taken away from this, trying to understand where, we're all kind of a brain that's desperately trying to understand the world. And, given the fact that we have a very finite brain that makes all kinds of mistakes, and we're looking out on a universe which is essentially infinite, and we get access to like this tiny, tiny, tiny little piece of it. The fact that we think anything at all is kind of remarkable. So, and that I think also, to me, that's part of that piece of this, which is that maybe we need to be understanding and compassionate to everyone, because all of our brains are really trying to do the same thing. We're all, and so whether it's, a combination of our genetics and our upbringing and our experiences and all the things that kind of bring us to where we are today. If there's 7 billion people in the world, there's 7 billion different religions in the world, and I think we need to appreciate how each person comes to that conclusion.
Yes, and let me steer us in. I know you've mentioned the multiplicity of belief system and religion, and today, I guess in a biased way, I am going to steer you down one path.
That's fine.
In sort of a way to say, tell me more about the research that you have done specifically with the Christian tradition.
Sure.
The Christian worldview of thinking.
Yeah. So, we've done a number of studies, as I mentioned, globally, we've looked at many different traditions, and we have studied, Buddhist, Hindu thought, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, as well as a variety of others. One of the first studies that we did was a group of Franciscan nuns, and they did a Christian-based practice called centering prayer that some of the people who are listening might be familiar with. It is a very contemplative kind of prayer process, focusing for the most part on a prayer or some type of phrase or story from the Bible. And the ultimate goal is through this meditative prayer, to engage God and to be able to sort of make this connection with God, to feel, there's different ways of describing it, but feeling connected with God, feeling at one with God. And so, for them, it is a deeply meaningful experience, and it really shows, what's going on in terms of how they engage that. And when we look at the brain, we see some very interesting changes. So, for example, when we looked at the nuns doing the centering prayer, one of the things that we saw was a decrease of activity in an area of the brain called the parietal lobe. And that's located, in the back of the brain. This is an area that takes our sensory information and helps us to create our sense of self. And so, so when it turns on, we kind of feel ourself. We feel where our self is and how our self relates to the world.
Well,
If there's a decrease in that area, then the person begins to lose that sense of self, and they lose that boundary between the self and the world, or the boundary between themselves and God. And in that regard, one of the things that we saw was this decrease that seems to be associated with that feeling of being connected to God very deeply. And and there's a lot of other areas that we also saw that were affected. So the frontal lobes in the nuns actually turned on, because they are attending the frontal lobes helps us to concentrate, and so it helps us to focus our attention on God, on a prayer, whatever it is that we're focused on.
And when we do this, and I cut you off there.
No, that's okay.
When we do this and we focus, we shift our focus to God, and we decrease, as you're saying there, activity in the parietal lobe and increase activity in the frontal lobe. What does that mean for us as human beings going through this practice of choosing a passage from the Bible and focusing on that passage from the Bible, and intertwining that with moving, transcending our reality, moving our mind to the presence of God, in deactivating the parietal lobe and activating the front? What does that mean for that person who's going through that practice?
Well, part of what's happening is that, there are several important pieces to that. One is that, when you talk about these deep spiritual experiences, they affect us in very profound ways. And so when somebody has that perception of connecting with God, and this is different than walking into church and saying a prayer and just feeling good about that. This is a very experiential process for them, and that connection, whether it's through this prayer or communion or whatever, becomes, what it does is it embeds that concept deeply into the brain itself. And so one of the things that we do know is that the more we engage different practices, the more we engage different beliefs, the more those beliefs become a fundamental part of who we are. And our frontal lobes are very involved in that process. Now, we talked earlier before really starting the interview about the psychology of things. And so when you're talking about a person who might be struggling with, feeling good about themselves, maybe with depression or anxiety, this ability to feel more connected to God, more connected to the world, and then of course these changes that are going on in the parietal and the frontal lobe connect to other areas of the brain, like the limbic system, which are where our emotional centers are. So that's part of what we see, that these practices wind up helping to reduce depression, anxiety in people as they feel more deeply connected to God. And so it's a very, it's a very strong experience. It's a very powerful experience. It's a very transformative experience. And that's something that we've also noted, that, it changes, not just what the person is doing in the moment, but it has a longer term effect on how they actually are and how they think about themselves, how they think about meaning and purpose in life and so forth. But that's kind of the short answer is that as they change the areas in their frontal and the parietal lobes, it's changing the way their brain perceives reality.
Wow. So you brought it up now, and this is where I get excited because I am a psychotherapist and I work with hundreds of people doing therapy. And what you're saying to me, when a person focus, for example, they take a text from the Bible, and it's a text that highlight God's love, God's compassion, God's grace, God's love and kindness, and they focus on that. You're saying that this has a positive impact on the brain to regulate the brain, to regulate neurochemicals and regulate different aspects of the brain for individuals who are struggling with either anxiety, depression, for those who might even experience trauma. You're saying spending time in the presence of God, focusing on his love and his compassion can have a revolutionary change in the brain. Is that sort of?
Well, definitely. And although, you raise a really important point too, and this has a direct relevance. We talked about neurotheology, the
Yes.
field that links our understanding of the brain with religion and spirituality. So part of what we're also talking about is this notion of the positive and the potential negative side of these things. So,
Hmm.
as you mentioned, if a person is able to feel connected to God and focuses on the love of God, the
Yes.
compassion, forgiveness, and so forth, then those very ideas become a part of their brain as well. So, if
Wow.
you're focusing on love and compassion, God's love and compassion, then those feelings of love and compassion can become part of the way that particular person looks at themselves, feels more love and compassion for them, internally, maybe more love and compassion for others, the relationships that they have, their family and friends,
Mm.
and so forth. And maybe even how they think about the world, more
Yeah.
compassion for taking care of the world, for taking care of others, charity and altruism, and so forth. Um,
And I think that's powerful because, like, when you think about depression, depression is said to be a negative look at the self, right?
right,
A negative look at the world around us, and a negative view of the future. That's almost like a triad for depression.
right,
And we're saying by this focus, by this shift into who God is, in the essence of His love, we get to see ourselves differently. We get to see our internal working differently. We get to see others differently, and we look at the world differently and look at our future differently. Wow,
right.
that's tremendous to know
It,
that spending time in God's presence in meditation, a practice like meditation, something we don't need to pay for it.
right. Well, absolutely right. It's free.
It's free.
um, And but again, there's some interesting issues about the negative piece of this as
Yes.
well, which are very relevant here. Which is that a
Yes.
lot of times when people have severe depression, for example, they
Hmm.
actually don't look at God as positive, but they look at
Yes.
God more negatively, and they may look at God as punishing them for maybe things that they
Hmm.
did earlier in their childhood. They wonder why God is maybe angry with them or something like that. And so a fundamental part of a therapeutic intervention may not only be important to address depression in and of itself,
Yes.
but the other aspects that are associated with that, and how, especially if somebody has a strong religious or spiritual view or
Hmm.
part of themselves, if that part has become negative, then that becomes relevant in terms of how
Yes.
one ultimately tries to heal through that process. But the negative side of a belief in God can also be problematic, and it's actually I'm hoping an important future area for neurotheology, because
Yes.
there are people who turn who have a very negative view about God, or maybe even use their view about God in a negative way to support anger, violence,
Yes.
and a lot of other very negative perspectives on the world. And so, terrorists who blow up a building of somebody who
Hmm.
doesn't believe the way they do. I mean, that's using religion and God in a very negative way.
Negative way.
And so, part of what I hope comes out of this whole field and thinking about neurotheology and ultimately the psychology of religion is
Yes.
how do we help to direct people in a way that is positive and utilize those positive concepts of compassion and love
I
and
love.
forgiveness as an important way of helping people to heal. And so and then of course, I bring in the neurotheology piece. So then it's
Yes.
like, well, what's going on in the brain? And it is an important question. What like one of the questions that I frequently, the sort of theoretical questions that I ask is that, oftentimes, let's say we have an older individual whose child is killed or in a car accident or
Mhm.
something like that. So, that person kind of has one of two options. One option is, so if they're a religious person, one option is to turn towards God.
Yes.
God is going to help me through the loss of my child. God is
Trauma.
going,
Yeah.
help me to forgive my child, the person who did it, whatever.
Yes.
And it becomes a very positive way of helping the person cope with it. Other people turn away from God, and
Yes.
say, why did God do, I've gone to church every week. Why did God take
Hmm.
my child away from me? And they ultimately wind up rejecting God. And
Yes.
so, what is the difference between those two different individuals? Is there something that's going on in the brain itself? Is it their own experiences? And this is where, people like yourself, I think, really come in to sort of find the ways of applying this information in a hopefully a way that helps people to move into a more positive way of thinking about things.
How important, and a few questions going on in my head and a few on the paper here, but how important is belief to this? So for example, I read a verse in the Bible that tells me, be anxious for nothing, but in everything give praises to God and thanksgiving to God. How important is it for me to really believe that fundamentally? Because I can recite that verse and it's a good memory to have because it sounds good. How important is it to believe that that is actually something God is saying to us? And if God is saying it to us, we can accept it and believe it and embrace it. How important is really believe what God is saying in the Bible, and what's the implication for that in our lives?
Right. Well, we've done some interesting studies looking at brain scan studies that have tried to address, not necessarily, in one way or another, that very question. And the best way I can answer your question is that what we have found is that when people are just kind of going through the motions, so to speak, we've done some studies where they've just literally read a prayer or they just recite a prayer without any real meaning to it. Yes, that activates the brain, but it does not do nearly the same thing as people who are fully engaged in that prayer practice and fully believe it. So, in fact, one of the interesting little studies we did, it was one person, but we had a colleague of mine who had done meditation for many, many years, but considered himself to be an atheist. And we asked him to meditate on God. And interestingly, his brain really didn't do very much. I mean, his frontal lobe sort of, kind of one went up a little, one went down a little bit, but it was almost like it was just sort of spinning wheels, so to speak. But it wasn't really able to grab onto anything. And we've done some other studies, again, looking at the depth of the practice and the depth with which the person does the practice. And so, the answer to your question ultimately is that when people do believe in something more actively and are fully engaged in it, they are much more likely to have the full effect. Now, again, one has to be cautious about how one applies that. I mean, if somebody is a complete atheist and they want nothing to do with prayer, telling them that they have to pray could be more problematic, and you have to kind of reach to people where they are.
Yes.
Maybe start them with meditation and kind of work into it. But for certainly for people who are religious, the more they can engage things that have meaning to them, and the beliefs that they hold are fundamental to how their brain ultimately operates, and that's why that's part of the basis of how religious traditions kind of work. That by repeating certain prayers over and over, there's a cute little phrase that neurons that fire together wire together, and the idea there is that if you focus on the love of God and you keep coming back to the love of God, the love of God, the love of God, then that is the neural connection that forms in your brain. And if you focus on the anger of God or the hatred of God or hating other people or whatever, then that becomes the way you are. And that, in the larger context of what's going on in the world today, it's very problematic because people keep sort of looking at media, online or television or whatever, that keeps kind of supporting their beliefs, which on one hand is okay because that helps to, formalize them and make them stronger. But if those beliefs keep being negative and it's like we're right and everybody else is wrong, then it can be very problematic for people, and it can be problematic as a society.
What I want to do now, I want to get into some stuff because I've mentioned to you that I've written this book, Neuroplasticity, Healing the Brain from Psychological Disorders Through Biblical Meditation. And in some of the reviews I've done, the articles, the reading I've done, putting this research together, when a person goes through a trauma, developmental trauma, that's the area I looked at, which basically from childhood, this person have gone through multiple traumas. We call it complex traumas. And then that have a lasting impression or impact on the brain. Some scientists even go as far as to say the frontal lobe, some of the areas in this section of the brain mainly the anterior cingulate cortex, the orbitoprefrontal cortex. Some researchers even say those areas goes offline. They become deactivated. And I even read an article recently that makes the argument that the Broca's area, that important for speaking and expressing oneself, also goes offline. And then you mentioned earlier the limbic system, but the limbic system goes into overdrive, especially the amygdala, the alarm system of the brain goes into overdrive. Based on what you've done, when a person, going back to our talk, when a person focus on, this is what I'm getting at in my book, when a person focus on God's love and God's compassion, and even though they might have been abused or went through some things in their lives, if they sort of see God as this loving, compassionate attachment figure, someone they can rely on, someone they can connect with, someone they can experience love with, how does that impact the brain regarding the areas I've just mentioned in terms of the frontal lobe, the limbic system, the Broca's area? Any thoughts around that?
Well, I mean, as your title implies, I mean, the great thing about the brain is that it has neuroplasticity and it can change. And even people who suffer very severe traumas, the good news is that there are ways of changing that over time.
That's good news.
You're right. And the harder question is, how does one do it, and how does one do it effectively? And again, it goes back to one of my points earlier, that all of us are so unique. So there is a challenge of, what is that sort of key that unlocks that other way of thinking about things for each person. But as you mentioned, I mean, part of what happens is that when one can find that key, when one can kind of find that path that works for them, then those new ways of thinking, the feelings of compassion and love and so forth, the optimistic view of the world, those are things that ultimately can become, as those neurons fire, they wire, and they can ultimately shift a person away from those very negative aspects. And we see it in other interventions as well, but even just the basic things of cognitive therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. So the more one does it, the more those new patterns become the way in which a person ultimately thinks. And as you mentioned, I mean, part of these areas like the frontal lobe, part of what that's doing is it helps us to kind of consciously, purposely focus on these new ways of thinking. And that's actually something that my colleagues and I have talked about a little bit, which is that there is this element that the person has to be kind of purposely willing to do this. And so, but if they are, that, if they're guided carefully and if things are watched carefully, they can ultimately have these kinds of spiritual experiences and beliefs that lead to a very positive way of having them, modify the reality with which through which they view the world.
Three things in what you just said there, three things stood out to me: attention, purpose, and proper guidance in how to do it. That's sort of summarized. Those are the three things I sort of hear jumping out when you're talking. That there must be some purpose to it. There must be an intention, a direct intention, and we clarify that intention. But with purpose and intention, it must be guided in a specific direction that might be helpful. As you mentioned before, if we see God as tyrannical, I think in your book you mentioned the four gods of America. But seeing God as this benevolent God. So it's important then, based on what you're saying, for purpose, intention, awareness, and the direction to which we go in terms of our practice. In light of that, I know you mentioned, I've heard this, and you can correct me or clarify this. I think this is like the minimum thing you recommend, and correct me if I'm wrong, that 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks was one of the research you did.
Right.
Tell me about that basic underlying premise of this 12 minutes a day for 12. How does that work in terms of practice? What does that start to change? That sounds very short, but I want to see first what you say about this 12 minutes, 8 weeks, and then we're going to expand on that.
Well, the study that you're specifically referring to was actually a particular practice that's referred to as Kirtan Kriya, and it's basically a very simple mantra-based practice. There, people repeat certain sounds over and over And as you mentioned, it's done over a 12-minute period. Interestingly, a lot of the times when we do a research study, what we look at and how we look at it is guided by what the practice is,
Yes, yes.
not by what we would like it to be.
Yeah.
So they came and they said, this is how long it is. Okay. That's what it is. Some practices last an hour. And in fact, although, and maybe an important point that you're kind of headed towards is this idea that, that part of what's important is not necessarily how long one does it. I mean, presumably the longer one does it, the more intense the experience might be.
Yes.
But very brief experiences, or excuse me, very brief practices can actually be very effective. And we studied this. It was 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks. And we showed that there were very significant changes in the brain in the areas that we've been talking about, in the frontal lobe, some of the parietal lobe, a very central structure called the thalamus, which regulates a lot of information back and forth between different parts of the brain. And I always say, well, if you can do this amount of change in, 12 minutes a day, you can imagine what a person could do if they really engaged it more actively. But I also want to, if I may, just come to,
Sure.
You mentioned some really important points too. We wrote another book called How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain. And in there, part of what we realized as part of the analysis of people who have had these transformative experiences is that while, there are the few people where it just happens to them fairly spontaneously, there is purposeful intent. People are striving for some type of enlightenment, some type of spiritual experience, some type of relationship with God. And in so doing, that's an important part of that process. And there's with that comes the notion of purpose and trying to engender those kinds of feelings. And then as one continues to engage that, there are as the purposefulness is part of the process, there is a certain degree of some type of practice, ritual, however one wants to define that becomes the essence of that journey and of that search. And then, interestingly, one thing which we haven't quite touched on yet is that at some point, what we have also found is that one of the essential elements of these experiences is a sense of letting go, as a sense of surrender. And when that happens, interestingly, what our data suggests is that the frontal lobe actually, instead of going up, goes down. And
that's powerful.
Yeah, it's very powerful. And actually, because what I think happens is, the frontal lobe also helps us to kind of keep all of our ideas in place. It's like the filing cabinet of our brain. And when the frontal lobe is taken offline eventually, and often this happens in these deep spiritual experiences, it's kind of as if, all these files that you had very carefully put, into their compartments are like thrown up into the air, and then you're now starting to put them all back together. And I think that in large part, that's the explanation of the transformative element, that it kind of takes away all of the ways in which you used to keep everything categorized, and now change that into a whole new way of looking at things. And that's part of what we're looking at from the neurotheological perspective too.
So let me try to put it in my way of understanding. So you're saying that if I get into these practice, again, meditation and praying, when I get into those practice experiences that I've had with, use the language you just used, with files probably misplaced, use that language, in my frontal lobe, by getting into meditative practice, prayer, I can basically take up those files, get those files, almost, let me use the word, rearrange those files and put them in their right order.
Right, exactly. And of course, that comes not just with, the beliefs, but it comes with the emotions as well. And, hopefully one starts to look at the world instead of a negative way or an anxious way, in a more optimistic and positive way, and less depressed kind of way.
That's powerful for the work, especially for my work I'm looking at. That's powerful because trauma is one of those things that dysregulates the brain. So in other words, when we go through trauma, we have different files and they're not categorized. They're just thrown there and the brain doesn't really know what to do with them. Thus, we
Right.
become anxious, becomes overwhelmed. We get chaotic. Some people start to use alcohol, drugs, because
Yeah.
they just don't know what to do with the experience they've gone through. And
Right.
we're saying, look, just spending time, not just, but it sounds very simplistic, but engaging in a meditative, biblical meditation or prayer can start to help us to rearrange and refile that
Mm.
experience in a way that we look at the world differently, we look at ourselves differently, and we see things from a different perspective. It doesn't
Right.
change what we've been through, but we're
Right.
now able to see it from a different perspective. That makes sense?
Exactly.
Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. And interestingly, uh, along those same lines, we wrote a couple of papers a bunch of years ago that looked at the process of forgiveness. And
Yes.
interestingly, yeah, obviously forgiveness. There's a lot of times where people need to forgive. Sometimes it's to forgive another person.
Yes.
Sometimes it's to forgive themselves. Sometimes it's to forgive God.
God, yes,
And
I agree with that.
you know, and and very much along the lines of what you just mentioned. I mean, part of what we recognized as that process of forgiveness is that rearranging of the perspectives. I mean, the injury itself doesn't go away, but
Yes.
you now recognize it in a different kind of context, and that sometimes can be very important for people to kind of break out of the inability to move forward, and get them to be able to go in new directions. And look, we see this. You've mentioned things like addictions too. I mean, a lot of a lot of the impetus for deep spiritual experiences is the kind of the proverbial hitting rock bottom.
Yes.
The whether it's the depression or the drugs or whatever, and then somebody, that spark goes off again, and they realize, hey, I've got to change the way I do things. And a lot of times, the notion of a higher power or God becomes a fundamental. You think about things like Alcoholics Anonymous and so forth. That invocation of a higher power is a really fundamentally important part of that process about how one
Yes.
starts to rethink the nature of themselves and the nature of the world around them,
Right.
and what they have control over. And it changes the way they look at reality. And again, one hopes that they do it in a way that turns out to be positive and transformative in a good way.
Another area I want to look at really quickly here. We look at structures of the brain and how biblical meditation and prayer change the different structure of the brain and regulate. We live in a time, and you're a doctor also,
Yes.
and I am one of those people who I'm not. I always make this clarification whenever I'm going to ask this question. I'm not against medication.
Right. No,
There's
neither
a
am
place for it,
I.
right?
Yeah,
There's a
absolutely.
place for it. So for my viewers and people, I ask this question not because I'm against medication, but as we trying to put this together.
Right.
We live in a very chemicalized society
Right.
in which we tend to say serotonin, dopamine, endorphin, all these neurochemicals we have, and we find different chemicals to put in there to regulate chemicals. So it's almost we live in a chemical society in many ways when it comes to the brain. So there is medication that can regulate our serotonin, regulate our dopamine. Tell me more from your experience and your research, Dr. Newberg. When we do prayer and biblical meditation or meditation, what implication does it have on specifically neurochemicals?
Well, a lot of the early work that we did, and continue to do, looks kind of more at general brain function, but there are a few studies, including one of our own, that address that question very directly. In fact, going back to your question about Christian practices, so
Yes.
one of the studies that I was very excited to be able to do was a study that sent people through a Christian retreat program. It was actually based off of the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius. And
Mm-hmm.
and so we had people. We actually scanned their brains initially, and then for a week they went through this very deep spiritual retreat program. A great deal of prayer, Bible study, self-reflection, and so forth. They did that for a week, and then they came back and we scanned them again. And we used a kind of scan that looks at the dopamine and serotonin system. And what we found was that as the result of going through that program, that their brain was primed to be more sensitive to the effects of serotonin and dopamine. And what that means is that when their brain releases serotonin and dopamine, they have a greater reaction. Now, why is that important? Well, part of the reason you mentioned it in the first place is that these are two neurotransmitters that are particularly involved in more positive emotions. So dopamine, the release of dopamine is part of the reward system. It's part of what makes us feel good. In the extreme cases, I mean, that's unfortunately part of how cocaine works. You take cocaine and it potentiates your brain to have a very powerful experience to dopamine. On the other hand, you mentioned the medications. Most of the antidepressants these days are medications that affect the serotonin system, that make the brain more sensitive to the serotonin that they have, and hopefully that helps to improve the person's symptoms. So it seems like through the natural process of a contemplative approach, a spiritual retreat kind of program, that you're able to do this more naturally. And again, as you said, I'm in the Department of Integrative Medicine, and there are people who need a medication, and that's fine too. But there are ways in which these natural practices can be done that, at the very least, might augment those medications. And it may be something. And in fact, as a lot of research outside of my domain has shown, that psychotherapeutic interventions like cognitive therapy and so forth, they're synergistic with medications. So if you just give somebody a medication, it's probably not going to work that well. But if you do that and you combine it with therapies and so forth, then that really enhances it. So depending on the circumstances, depending on the person, utilizing these different medications can be beneficial, especially in conjunction with spiritual programs. But the spiritual programs by themselves could be strong enough. It depends on the individual person and obviously who's helping them through that process. But yeah, so it's definitely something, and it's something that we have a lot more to learn about. Like I said, I've done one study. There's one other study that showed that a certain type of yoga meditation practice released dopamine in the brain. There's been a couple of interesting studies using MRI, which have shown a release of a neurotransmitter called GABA, which stands for gamma aminobutyric acid for your listeners. And interestingly, that is the site where anti-anxiety medications work. So again, and there are certainly plenty of studies which have shown that meditation and prayer and other spiritual practices reduce anxiety, reduce depression, and we're starting to, piece all of this together.
As we get to the close here, one of the things I recommend in my book, and I'm just going to outline it for you. I'll even just go to the book and just what I recommend, and you can tell me what you think. And probably the first time you're hearing this, so this almost put you on the spot to correlate what I put in this book with your research and your ideas, right? So in this book, I sort of outline a practice that I said, hey, this is something I think, based on the research I've done, your work I've reviewed, and others have reviewed their work, this is something I propose that can have tremendous benefit. I'm just going to read through it here with you. What I recommend is a person gets up, when they get up in the morning, one of the first things that they should do in the morning is start a devotional life. And what that looks like, they will have a prayer. They can tuning into God, having this prayer. After the prayer, they will sing a song, a spiritual song that means something to them. That they're either, if they can sing or not. If they can't sing, then listen to one or two songs just to regulate themselves there. Then I recommend finding a Bible verse. For example, I'm just open the book here to page 161, where I mentioned this practice for depression. One of the Bible verses I mentioned there is taken from Psalm 34 and verse 18 and 19. It says this: "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. A righteous man have troubles, but the Lord will take care of him." And I will say to people, have your prayer, sing a few songs, and take up a Bible verse like this, read it, meditate on the verse until you almost feel that verse become a part of you. And then as you go throughout the day, you're going to figure out what that verse means to you. You don't need to get into theology or whatever anybody else think the verse means to them. Just want to figure out, what does this verse means to you? How do you correlate this verse to your life? And as you go throughout the day, you keep this verse in mind. At the end of the day, you come back and you do the same thing before you go to bed, and using the same verse. And that's sort of a recommendation I give to people. From your perspective, listening to that recommendation, what we've talked about, what's the implication if we really get into a practice like that? Again, we talked about awareness, focus, and a direction. And this is a direction I'm trying to give to people. People ask me all the time, how do I do this? From your research, your own idea of correlating and putting it together, recommending a practice like that, just your own thoughts about what the implication of something like this.
Well, I mean, it sounds very similar to some of the more, general ideas that we do talk about, as you mentioned, in the How God Changes Your Brain. So, one of the things we discuss is like, we call it our innermost values practice. And that's kind of similar to what you're just describing, which is to come up with a specific idea, a specific, the nice thing about what you're proposing is that you're sort of selecting something from a source, in this case, the Bible, which makes it obviously there's an authority to that source. It's tried and true. It's been around for 2,000 years. So, there's a great deal of value in something that's already known, but that the idea of then, bringing that into something that you would continue to focus on, as you said, doing it throughout the day to take this kind of positive message and to keep coming back to it and keep focusing on it. Again, in a lot of our work, because we reach across different traditions, we kind of keep it a little bit broader. But, to say, well, for someone who's Christian, this is the kind of practice that would be the appropriate thing to do. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense the way you describe it. It sounds like something that would, as you said, kind of, be consistent with what we know about how the brain works. And we talk a lot about rituals in our work, and the value of the ritual, which is really what you're kind of describing, is coming back to something, to come back as a statement, as a phrase, as a song, as an idea. And if that's something that you kind of keep coming back to, that rhythmic element of it is part of what ultimately kind of drives that idea into the way the brain is working, with the ultimate goal of trying to change the brain from some of the more negative ways of looking at things into something that's more positive. And again, that to me, though, is always the critical piece, which is, you select a phrase like, that God is supporting the downhearted. That's fundamental. Very different than God is killing, those who don't believe. And so, part of what people, and this is where the guidance comes in, I think, we talked about that a little bit earlier, which is, people need to be able to process through the traumas and the various issues that they're dealing with, but also be able to, to keep coming back to those things which are positive, and to be careful, so to speak, or at least to watch out for when things can become negative, and how does one work through that as well. But I think what you propose, again, is a specific example of a broader approach that we've talked about a lot, and makes a lot of sense, and is something that arguably should be very effective for people, provided that it's consistent with their beliefs and is something that takes them in the positive direction.
Yeah, and again, that's part of one of the main thing. I guess I cater you cater to the general populace.
Right.
I target more people who are within the Christian tradition.
Right.
And how this can meditation sometimes in some circles I've been in, within my own tradition and others, when they hear the word meditation, some people want to shy away from it. They want to run away from it, right?
Right.
So one of the driving force behind this was to establish that no, Christianity itself is deep rooted in meditation.
Right.
And not, again, going back to the dichotomy of the multiplicity of different belief systems. When some people in my Christian tradition hear meditation, they immediately want to critique and say, oh, we're taking something from this tradition and
Buddhism,
that tradition, and we can't embrace it. I'm saying, no, you may not need to take from that tradition, but you look in your own tradition, it is embedded, because almost all religions we have today, apart from probably Scientology, almost all major religions we have today are based from the East. So there are characteristics that runs through most of them: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. They're all Eastern in nature. So there are certain characteristics that permeates all of them. So that was one of the reason for me pulling towards biblical meditation was to show that within the Christian community, we also have prayer, we also have meditation, and
Right.
we can embrace the neurological benefits that prayer and meditation has to offer us.
Sure.
And Dr. Newberg, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. And I have one more thing to ask you, but
Absolutely.
in this section first, so I want to thank you so much for joining me today. And I thank you for sharing your insight, your knowledge. I thank you for the work that you've been doing, and continue to do this work. I probably never asked you this question. I should ask you before I go. What are you working on now?
Well, you mentioned something that I think is very important. Up until now, a lot of the work that I've done has been more broadly focused for obvious reasons. But we have started to get into thinking about individual traditions and how neurotheology can be applied to Christianity itself, how it can be applied to Judaism, Islam, and so forth. So I think that that's a future direction that is important. And I think, the other part of the work that you're doing is another piece of this. And we've been calling it applied neurotheology, which is, how do we kind of take this information and help to come up with more pragmatic and, and effective ways to help people, on the ground, dealing with life and dealing with various issues and problems that they have that, would be very effective for people. So I think, developing programs like what you're working on, looking at other types, helping people to compare programs in different ways to understand which things might be more effective for anxiety versus depression versus trauma. Even within a tradition, are there certain types of phrases or prayers that might be better for someone to do if they have depression versus if they have anxiety or if they have substance abuse? Yeah. So there's a lot to, there's a lot to learn, and that's very exciting. And then, you mentioned the other thing on a more neurophysiological level, which is thinking about the neurotransmitters and the chemicals in the brain that are involved in this. And we still have a long way to go. So lots of work for us left to do, which is good, fun, and exciting.
Yes. Again, thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to connecting with you again. And really, again, it was a pleasure to be able to connect with you and have this discussion, Dr. Newberg. And I thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.